Only free men can negotiate. Prisoners cannot enter into contracts. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated. This is 1985. Nelson Mandela refused to bargain for his freedom after he'd been in prison for 21 years. Why? Because he wasn't a free man. So a free man cannot enter into contracts. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated. There have been lots of people that have used this language, oppressors versus the oppressed. Bernie Sanders, Che Guevara, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, Paulo Freire. And Paulo Freire is actually one of the main theorists for this. Paulo Freire, he actually really breaks it down. Here's a couple more quotes. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say that you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. Only the oppressed has the sufficient humanity, the quest to be human, in order to liberate both. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. Nelson Mandela, after he became president. Desmond Tutu was also a freedom fighter in South Africa. Now, this was during the apartheid region. You had a minority of whites who were controlling all of South Africa. And so this is a situation which is clear who the oppressors are, who the oppressed are. Desmond Tutu, he said, if you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. I just mentioned that if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. He also said, be nice to the whites. They need you to rediscover their humanity. That's what Paulo Freire talks about. Paulo Freire talks about finding our humanity. The oppressor robs the humanity of the oppressed. The oppressed do what the oppressor wants out of love. Out of love. And from that love, we can free everybody. And of course that's true. A police officer is beating somebody up and you walk by, you just chose the side of the police officer. Even if it's not a police officer, if it's just a person robbing somebody else and you walk by, you have chosen to not intervene. Yeah, maybe you're trying to stay safe, you don't want to get involved, you don't want to get hurt, but you've chosen the side of the injustice. You can't be neutral on a moving train. Howard Zinn wrote a book, You Cannot Be Neutral on a Moving Train. Silence is betrayal. That's MLK. Florence Reese asks, which side are you on? We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Elie Wiesel. Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Paulo Freire. Often in liberal community development fields, there's a strong desire to remain impartial and objective. However, by doing that, you side with the powerful. You cannot divorce yourself from your role in the room or in the place where you're at. Martin Luther King, the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in times of great moral conflict. An individual who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. Silence is betrayal. Silence is betrayal. Speak out against any and all injustice, both large and small. Share the voices of those committed to exposing injustice. Analyze areas of your organization and life to see where you have remained neutral in order to decide how you will be active against oppression. Che Guevara says that he cannot liberate anybody. He's not a liberator. We have to liberate ourselves, because if somebody says, I am your leader, then they become the oppressors. Sometimes you need leadership, but only because they reflect the consensus of the group that they represent. Real revolutionaries adorn themselves on the inside, not on the surface. Che Guevara, if you tremble with indignation at every injustice, I add oppression, then you're a comrade of mine. Oppressors. In countries, the large landholders realized they couldn't survive alone and promptly entered into alliances with the monopolies, the strongest and most ruthless oppressors of the Latin American peoples. Large landowners. That's true today. in America. It was during those long and lonely years that my hunger for the freedom of my own people became a hunger for the freedom of all people, white and black. I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken away from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. When I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. Some say that now has been achieved, but I know that that is not the case. The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just beginning. Nelson Mandela, and that reflects what Paulo Freire says on Pedagogy of the Oppressed on page 44. This, then, is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. Any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. So here's a little candy, here's a little bit of freedom. Now still, generosity is an important term to memorize. Here's a little bit of freedom, here's a little bit of money, here's a little bit of, some of the freedom or some of the power that I have. Now be my slave. I give you some, I pay your bills, be my slave. But almost always during the initial stage of the struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. The very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions of the concrete existential situation by which they were shaped. Their ideal is to be men, but for them to be men is to be oppressors. This is their model of humanity. So false generosity, get false generosity in your head. False generosity is generosity that is false. It's meaning to, get you back in your role, know your place. You're underneath me. Here's a little bit of breadcrumbs. Well, I don't want breadcrumbs of freedom. I want a full menu. That's Desmond Tutu. Real revolutionaries adorn themselves on the inside, not the surface. Che Guevara, we cannot be sure of having something to live for unless we are willing to die for it. Che Guevara. Tupac said, if you cannot find something to live for, find something to die for. I'm not a liberator. Liberators do not exist. They exist when people liberate themselves. Che, the revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe. You have to make it fall. And that was when 1965, so I want to say that's Congo. Silence is argument carried. Another quote by Che Guevara that mentions oppressors. Why does the guerrilla fighter fight? We must come to the inevitable conclusion that the guerrilla fighter is a social reformer, that he takes up arms responding to the angry protest of the people against their oppressors, and that he fights in order to change the social system that keeps all his unarmed brothers in ignominy and misery. Oppressors. We must fight against the oppressors. Che Guevara. As Marxists, we have maintained that peaceful coexistence among nations does not encompass coexistence between the exploiters and the exploited, between the oppressors and the oppressed. Che Guevara, addressed to the United Nations. Page 56, for the oppressors, however, it is always the oppressed, whom they never obviously call the oppressed, but depending on whether they are fellow countrymen or not, those people, or the blind and envious masses, or savages, or natives, or subversives, who are affected, who are violent, barbaric, wicked, or ferocious, when they react to the violence of the oppressors. Yet it is paradoxical, though it may seem, precisely in the response of the oppressed to the violence of their oppressors, that a gesture of love may be found. consciously or unconsciously, the act of rebellion by the oppressed, an act which is always or nearly always as violent as the initial violence of the oppressors can initiate love. Whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter to this violence is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. As the oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. As the oppressed, fighting to be human, take away the oppressor's power to dominate and suppress, they restore to the oppressors the humanity they had lost in the exercise of oppression. It is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught. And the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of the new man, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but man in the process of liberation. If the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they will not achieve their goal by merely reversing the terms of that contradiction, by simply changing poles. It may seem simplistic. Pleasure in complete domination over another person or other animate creature is the very essence of the sadistic drive. Another way of formulating the same thought is to say that the aim of sadism is to transform a man into a thing, something animate into something inanimate, since by complete and absolute control, the living loses one essential quality for life: freedom. Freedom is an indispensable condition. Just to be a human, you can't authentically love, you can't authentically feel jealous or feel anger. You're not a person. You are a sub-person. You are a slave. You don't even have freedom. You're not even to them. You're a thing. You're a tool to be controlled. You're a slave. So you're not a person to them. And if you accept it, you're not probably a person to even yourself. Sadistic love is a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness, in order to dominate, tries to deter the drive to search, the restlessness and the creative power which characterize life. It kills life. More and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose, the maintenance of the oppressive order through manipulation and repression. The oppressed, as objects, as things, have no purpose except those their oppressors prescribe for them. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without that trust. Those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. The fact that certain members of the oppressor class join the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, thus moving from one pole of the contradiction to the other, theirs is a fundamental role and has been throughout the history of this struggle. It happens, however, that as they cease to be exploitators or indifferent spectators or simply the heirs of exploitation and move to the side of the exploited, they almost always bring with them the marks of their origin, their prejudices, and their deformations, which include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. Accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malefic as that of the oppressors. The generosity of the oppressors is nourished by an unjust order, which must be maintained in order to justify that generosity. Our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them, and trust in the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without that trust. Trust is the most important thing in a relationship. Without trust, that's not a relationship. If you have trust, that's a very good relationship. Julian Assange, he talks about how you train your character in situations of oppression and injustice to do nothing. When you go to school, when somebody's being, the teacher is calling somebody out and just, chastising them or yelling at them or telling them to do this and do that and just being a real dickhead, we all watch, we don't do a single thing. Think about, don't tase me, bro. Don't tase me, bro. Right? He's getting beat up by the police. John Kerry keeps on speaking. Nobody in the audience moves. Nobody gives a shit. The state has a monopoly of violence, so partially we're going to get hurt, right, if we do the right thing. But we got to do the right thing. We got to fight for our liberation. My and your freedom cannot be separated. It can't be separated. Free men enter into contracts. So if your true generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity constrains the fearful and subdue the rejects of life to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication so that more and more they become human hands which work and working transform the world. Paulo Freire, washing one's hand of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. There is no neutrality. You cannot be neutral on a moving train. Silence is betrayal. Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on? Florence Reese out of the Harlan Coal Miners' Strikes. Which side who do not act dialogically but insist on imposing their decisions, do not organize the people, they manipulate them, they do not liberate, nor are they liberated, they oppress. And if the structure does not permit dialogue, then the structure needs to be changed. The more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality so that knowing it better, he or she can transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into a dialogue with them. This person does not consider himself or herself the proprietor of history or of all people or the liberator of the oppressed and the liberator of the oppressed, but he or she commits himself or herself within the history to fight at their side. They're not your liberator, but they'll fight at your side. And that's what we need, people who will fight at each other. More quotes, and then I'll get to the conclusion. I'll get to my point, okay? So Nelson Mandela, I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken away from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. Nelson Mandela in his long walk to freedom. A freedom fighter learns the hard way that it is the oppressor who defines the nature of the struggle, and the oppressed is often left no recourse but to use methods that mirror those of the oppressor. At a point, one can only fight fire with fire. Nelson Mandela. So, Bernie Sanders had wrote this supposedly controversial essay in 1972, and it's actually really good. It's about gender roles, and everybody should read it. And he's kind of saying, like, what do we do now? Before, woman was submissive, man was oppressor. Well, he used the word oppressor, that's the only point, but read it and check it out. Let's think about the Black Lives Movement. Okay, the Black Lives Movement were protesting Bernie Sanders in the very beginning, and they were like in his face, you know. It's like, just because you marched with Martin Luther King and just because you're treated like black people, they really didn't know what they were talking about. Bernie Sanders essentially let them have the stage and give them the microphone, and he walked away. So why would he do that compared to Trump, who uses the forces of society and says, take that person out, take that person out, take that person out? Bernie Sanders didn't do that. Bernie Sanders, in fact, he was beaten. He was trumped, right? And Trump was like, this article, op-ed news that is essentially defending him and saying that if Bernie had used the authoritarian forces and power in order to get them to comply and get him to speak, it sucks. Everybody went there to see Bernie Sanders speak. And the activists, finally they did protest Donald Trump, and it was crazy, right? It was, I was nervous. I was scared for them. So, the liberals do need to, be held accountable. But I think you're really missing the boat if you're attacking your allies and letting the Ku Klux Klan do whatever they want to do. You go, if you go to the plantation and you are attacking the white person who says we need to be free versus the slave owner, well, you're fucked up. I think you're messed up. You don't really know what the hell is going on. But let's go back to that plantation. That's the oppressors and the oppressed. It's very clear cut. You have the slaves and the slaves. You have the slave masters and the slaves. Also think about the classroom. One dictator, 30 slaves, 30 intellectual slaves. And corporations are like that. A lot of things are like that. So you have the slave masters and the slaves. Well, how come a family of 5 white people could control 30 black folks? How are they able to do that? They are, clearly the 5 they're in the minority, and they are abusing their authority in order to, use coercion to take whatever free labor, to take all the, money that they could make from the free labor. Why would they do that? How do teachers get 30 students in the classroom to comply? There's only one teacher. They can't arrest us all. They can't stop us all. But instead of having a solidarity, instead of teaching us that we're all in this together, we're divide and conquer. That's how they maintain their authority. They maintain their power. And Franz Fanon had pointed out in Africa during the French colonization, they wouldn't do shit to the French colonizers who were chopping people's heads off and just doing these ferocious things, burying black people in the sand, let the crows peck at them and shit. They weren't doing shit to them, but as soon as another black man just gave them a stink eye or did something very little disrespect, they was ready to die. They was ready to fight and die. It's a way to get their humanity back. So in a way, the Black Lives Matter protest and Bernie Sanders kind of legitimated his campaign. Oh, he's somebody to protest against. Good, I'm glad y'all did that. But that's the slaves attacking the slaves, and it's not attacking the actual power structure. He's been on the marginalized for 40 fucking years. He's the independent in the city, the only one who chastised Alan Greenspan. He's the only one that went against the Iraq War. He's been principled for a long ass time. He marched with MLK. He's been dead my entire life, but Bernie might actually benefit from some white privilege. He is not the one. He's the ally. He is the one that'll fight by your side. Whereas Trump is sitting there saying all this racist shit, right? And fuck the Muslims, fuck the Mexicans. So my point is essentially this: when it comes to personal relationships, I think we do need to have a conversation about the bigger society, because you have bankers and you have the politicians and you have the police and you have these bigger structures of power systems that are the oppressors, and we're all the oppressed in that sense. But if you get to the very small level, to the microcosm, to the to the very to the personal relationships, one person and another person, then how is that supposed to look? So man and woman, let's fuck the hierarchy. No hierarchy. There's no boss and there's no slave. There is equality, and that's it. And we could be equalists, we could be humanists, and to be more fully human. But how does that relationship look? What does that relationship look like? So you got the oppressor, you got the oppressed. And I say, fuck that, hierarchy. Now we're side by side. Now how does that relationship work? Sometimes you do little things for each other, but you still maintain your autonomy. So you're obedient and you're independent. You maintain your autonomy, or are you just wildly free, and whenever you all hang out, you just, love to be together, and the magic of love maintains that relationship. I err on the latter just because I haven't had freedom for most of my life. So freedom or die, freedom or death, right? Just like they said, Patrick Henry said. But I would like for you to comment in the section below, because, the relationships that I've seen that have succeeded, there's always been one person who wants to possess the other, and they keep them there. And that's how relationships have worked. That seems to be the only long-term relationships that seem to work, is when one person says, I keep you. And maybe perhaps they both keep each other. I keep you, you keep me. And then because we're keeping each other, we're, keeping everybody else out. It's possessive, but if you maintain your humanity, can you be possessive? Can you have freedom and be obedient? Sometimes the level you submit to is the level of injustice perpetuated upon you. So should you never, if I'm sitting here and I have something in front of me and you say, hey, can I have that? Yeah, sure, no problem. Like, what's the big deal about that? It doesn't seem like that's a big deal. But if the idea is, I'm going to get them to do a little thing and then another little thing, and I'm going to handle my man, I'm going to handle him because he's going to kiss my ass, and no, fuck that. Who the fuck wants to live that way? Fuck the hierarchy. Fuck the hierarchy. So I'm not the oppressor, but I'm also not the oppressor. I'm not the slave. I'm not the master, just like Abraham Lincoln. If you have any, if you can help me out, let me know, because nobody else talks this language or speaks any of the things that I just actually mentioned just now.